But then you say the second thing, which is beyond being able to fight, I really enjoyed, or combat helped make me who I am. Can you talk about, and feel free not to if it's not right, what is the sort of the poetry of combat that allows you to more fully develop, that allowed you to more fully develop as a human being beyond the ability, let's say, to just handle yourself in a fight, where you're actually applying this now with leverage in terms of weaponry, in terms of command, in terms of strategy, tactics in a life and death situation?
You know, all that stuff that you just mentioned, I absolutely love, and I've spent my entire life trying to get good at tactics with weapons, maneuver on the battlefield, combat leadership, and all those things are awesome. And that is certainly the things in combat that you get to experience. But the bottom line is this: when you go into combat, you got people that are trying to kill you, and at some point you realize, okay, I could die tonight, and if I die, bring it. And I think for me, you know, the idea, you know, people go through life, you got death out there in the future, and they either don't want to face it, or it's so far away that they don't need to face it, or they put it in the back of their mind. Well, when you go into war, it's coming to the front of your mind, and you get to answer that question that some people wait their whole lives to answer, is what am I going to do when it's time to die? And once you answer that question for yourself, then for me, I was like, okay, you know, I here we go. And if I die, okay.
You're familiar with this movie, No Country for Old Men?
Absolutely. Well, and I've, you know, read the book. Cormac McCarthy's my favorite fiction author.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know. The famous gas station scene where Anton Chigurh is this sort of methodical hitman of potentially supernatural origin, is offended that this guy transgresses a politeness boundary and asks one too many questions. And he traps him into this coin toss. And he says, what's the most you've ever lost on a coin toss? And the guy says, you know, I don't know. And he says, well, you have to call the coin. He says, I didn't put anything up. And the hitman says, oh, you've been putting it up your whole life. Every day, as you leave the studio, you're going to be taking a risk with your life as you walk across the street that somebody's on their phone texting and not paying attention. And yet most people don't know that. They imagine that death is this incredibly remote thing. They don't see bodies. There are fewer open caskets, probably. We cremate people. We don't visit graves. There are all sorts of things that are keeping us in an abstraction where death seems very, very remote. Are you saying that combat was liberating specifically because you were forced to say, I am playing with the full stack and I've accepted that, and your comment, bring it? I mean, it's a terrifying thing to say in a life and death situation. How do you see that if you crossed over some threshold?
I think it's a matter of acceptance, of accepting the fact that this is what is going to happen. And, you know, you talk about not visiting graves. I mean, I visit my friends' graves all the time.
I go to national cemeteries and I see, you know, that there'll be some person who died in, like, let's say the 50s or the 40s, and there are fresh flowers on that particular grave. It's very moving.
So I don't know if liberating is the word, but perhaps it is. I think, again, and you know, Sam Harris, he asked a very pointed question on his podcast. He said, you know, you talk about war being hell, which I do, and being awful, which I do, and which it is. And then, you know, I say that combat was like the best time that I've had in my life. And he says, how do you reconcile those two statements? And what I said to him was, I asked him if he ever knew anyone that had cancer and lived. And he said, yes. And I said, and when you ask those people, they very often give the answer, I'm glad it happened to me. This is what I learned from it. They had to face death. And once they were through it, they realized, you know, they wouldn't wish it on their worst enemy, but they're glad that they went through it because they learned. And I think that to me is what combat is like. You have to face your own mortality, and you have to recognize that, you know, you could die. And then when you're done, you get back and you realize that the sun coming up in the morning is a beautiful thing.
Can imagine.